Okay. So thank you, anyone who is watching. This is the IxDA Cleveland June event, the second event that we've had in June. We are based in Cleveland. This is our first live video that we're doing on YouTube Live. And I'm really happy to say that someone I know and admire, Boon Sheridan, is agreed to be our speaker for this. Boon has had lots of job titles. Well, we got content specialist, information architect, stage manager, and voiceover actor are amongst one or a few of his many talents. And what he's doing today is he's going to be sharing with us a topic that he's looking at and hopefully maybe turning into a book, which is complementary design skills. So with that, I will now turn it over to Boon.
Cool. All right, I am now presenting to everyone. Wicked. All right, let me adjust this. Hey, everybody. My name is Boon Sheridan. It says so somewhere on my underwear, so I have to believe that. Kind of cool to be here. Very cool to catch up with Dave again, and kind of great to see another IxDA chapter, coming back to life. I think Dave said it was a little quiet for a while, so kudos to him and folks in Cleveland to bring it back, because it's always kind of fun to do your own work, but it's even better to do work and then talk to friends and say, hey, so I'm doing this thing. It's not going the way I wanted. Am I crazy? And people go, no, you're not crazy. That shouldn't be happening that way. And I love that, being able to share war stories and trade information. And that's a lot of what I want to talk about today. Share some stories about something that's been happening to me and some work that I was doing, and turned into some exploration around my own process, what I thought I did as a designer, what I would like to do in the future as a designer, and spending a little time thinking about the definitions of my own skills and expanding some of those definitions and looking for complementary skills, hence why I originally said complementary skills. So let me do something here. I've had to cat-proof my office because I live in an old church, and as you can see, I have big doors back there, and I have a big door on the other side there, and the cats have learned, because the doors are very old, they can throw their weight against them and push one open, so I had to wedge some stuff up against the bottom there. So let's talk about skills and thinking about what you know, what you don't know, and how do you know what you know and what you don't know. It's a mouthful. I'm not even sure if it makes sense. But what I'm thinking about is, about a year ago, I moved. And with most moves comes that question of, why am I taking all these books with me? This is only about half of the collection, and a large number of them are UX books. A huge chunk of them are Dungeons and Dragons books, but that's for a talk for another day. I found myself asking, how many of these books really should come with me? I've had them for years. Do they still make sense? Are they worth keeping? And I started wondering about what books had aged out, what books had stood the test of time. I have 2 or 3 copies of the Polar Bear book as it's gone through iterations. I have some books that were talking about design and contextual design well before the web was really common. Some of the early Jacob Nielsen books, which are talking about usability in the very early days of the web. And even a great old book, or an older book now, by Jeffrey Veen, Return on Art and Science of Web Design. So a lot of these books were very helpful, but as I read through them again, it was interesting to know what had changed. What from the old ideas still made sense? What was, hey, this is really cool, but now technology or platform or opinions have changed. And so I started to make new piles of books. Then, in the last year or two, I've been doing some critique sessions for General Assembly, spent a little time talking to younger designers or folks who are starting their career in design. And a common question is, what would be a great book to recommend? If I could buy one book, what should I go get to help me be a better designer? So suddenly, this interesting experiment of these are the books that I still want to read, and then what book would I recommend, turned into this this really fun experiment, I shouldn't call it an experiment, this fun exercise of looking at what I valued from older books, what I valued, what they taught me, and how they created my own practice. Now, I will say, after going through a ton of old books and the things that I thought, or the value I thought they brought, or how helpful they were to me, I will say that something that really surprised me is there's this wonderful book called Return on Design. And what's great about this book by Annie Fio is that she put this book out in, I believe, 2003, and it was the only design book she's ever done. If you go look up Annie Fio on Amazon, you will find a ton of cookbooks. She is an amazing chef and has basically turned into one of the most amazing people when it comes to working with food. But looking back, this is one of the books that you can get for a penny on Amazon that I still think holds a lot of value. It talks about different things like sitemaps and wireframes and navigation that have changed a little bit, but the core of it is still so useful and so helpful. So as spending a little more time talking about what books you'd recommend, and I'd recommend what books I wanted to go find because I was trying to identify gaps in my knowledge and suggesting to people, well, where do you think you could learn more? Because the answer is always, you can learn more. There's always something else to learn. There's always something cool to pick up. I started trying to identify where I thought the gaps in my knowledge were and what parts of my personal design process and my personal experience could be beefed up, which turned into trying to do a little bit of definition of what my own work process was. And I'm not sure if you've ever taken the time to do this, but it's, again, it's a borderline philosophical. Sometimes it helps with a cocktail or two, or after a cocktail or two, to sit down and talk about, just map out to yourself, how do you do what you do? What is your practice? And what is your method for coming up with designs? It even gets more confusing when right about now, I think we have 4 or 5 different thinking methods going in discussions and that you can find books on. You have design thinking, innovation thinking, product thinking. I've seen empathy thinking floating around there, which kind of makes me throw up in my mouth a little bit. But the idea is that there's all these different folks pushing really good information into the middle about how to structure your own approach and how to structure what you do. But what I thought was fascinating is I came up with a slightly different set of groupings for my practice, how I designed, and what I thought could turn into an interesting way to help talk to other people about process, design, and what I do as a designer. And I came up with 4 groups or 4 groupings of areas of my own practice that I thought I needed to make sure were solid. And I'll show these to you now. So the idea was theory, experience, information, and guidance. My handwriting is kind of terrible. But that idea of, for my own design practice and my own work to be fun and productive, I had to make sure I knew my theory. And then beyond the theory, I had to have experience or practice in those areas to sharpen them. And then I thought it was fascinating because the more time I spent with it, I was realizing there's times when you need inspiration and there's times where you need guidance. And I think they're very different things. And at times I was muddling them. So I had a great chat with Lou Rosenfeld a while ago on a podcast, and we were talking about this. And he says that his response was, it's not just a personal approach, but it's a lot of companies and how teams operate. And I think it's something that anyone can define a little bit differently. The groupings are probably different for different folks, but the core concepts are about the same. That idea of the theory of your design, the practice or experience of the things that you do, and then that inspiration. Where do you get inspiration? How do you find it? And then guidance. How do you grow? How do you go from one level of design to improvement? How do you get better along the way, not just from your practice, but someone who can help point you in the right direction? So from all that came this idea of what skills I needed to identify and balance out, and the idea of those complementary design skills. We have title. I know when you say complementary design skills, traditionally you might think of things like painting, photography, industrial design, animation, cooking. A lot of great designers I know do something else entirely, right? You know, some of my favorite designers and interaction designers, UX designers, I'm going to continue to say designers, came from another discipline, right? I mean, I think Brad Coble is watching, and Brad's an amazing illustrator. My friend Charlene McBride started as an animator. So, you know, animators, they've got some sort of a leg up on this whole design thing. I don't know what it is, but I want to learn more about it. So I started to think about complementary design skills within each of these areas: theory, experience, information, and guidance. So when I got to theory, I started to think about what are my design skills and how you can come up with what a group of skills underneath design might be. And I'm not talking about what you'd call technical skills. You know, when a recruiter will call up and say, you know, are you an 8.5 on JavaScript and a 9.5 on Sketch, and can you do this and that? I'm not as interested in those sort of quantifications, but I was very interested in this set of skills. Four things: questioning, clarifying, synthesizing, and interpreting. And those to me are the core of what I do as a designer, right? That idea of, for example, you know, if someone puts a cocktail in front of me, I question it. What is this cocktail? What is the name of it? Clarification. What's in this cocktail? What are the ingredients? Synthesizing it. Do these flavors mingle? Does this make sense? Is this something that should go together? And then interpreting it. I understand what you were trying to do, and yes, I think I'll have another. Within the idea, let's try that again. Within those areas of questioning, clarifying, synthesizing, and interpreting are some of the key parts of what design is and can be. And what I found is that I was looking at my own work and where I've been successful and where I've been less successful than I wanted to be. One of those wasn't as strong. And more specifically, when I started talking to folks that ran design teams, managed design teams, asked what they wished their teams did a little bit better or what the skills they wanted to prioritize to grow on their team, synthesis and interpretation came up over and over again, which I thought was fascinating. It's that idea of how do you turn information into a great design? And I'm thinking very specifically, there's been some wonderful writing on this by John Kolko. He's actually done a wonderful essay on his site called Abductive Thinking and Sense Making, the Drivers of Design Synthesis. And it was great because it put into words a lot of things that I've been stumbling about in the dark trying to define. But of course, here's John Kolko saying, no, let me define it for you really clearly, and here are all the things that go into it. And there's that moment of, personally for me, it was that moment of, is it a face, or is it two faces, or is it a vase? Two faces or a vase? And so I thought it'd be fun to spend a little more time drilling into those skills, that idea of questioning, clarifying, synthesizing, and interpreting, and try to define them a little bit to try to help figure out how to grow my own skills and maybe work with partners and talk to teams about developing those skills as well. So I want to dig a little bit into each one. And again, talk about what does it mean and how do they complement great design. So questioning. I think we, as the design world, there's a lot of love for the 5 whys. I'm really cautious when I say we because I really can speak for no one, can't speak for anyone but myself. But the 5 whys gets passed around a lot. And I love the idea of the 5 whys in principle. In practice, every time I've tried it, I've had a client look at me and go, all right, you're on your 4th why. Are you done? So there has to be something else besides 5 whys. And what I'm fascinated by is that idea of questioning the information that you get to help when you start your design process, and questioning the goals of the project as well. And I think design is very used to usability and ease of use as a big goal. Most of us start a project and we don't even have to talk about it. Usability is a goal for the project. This, whatever we're designing, should be easy to use. And as an industry, as ease of use started to become table stakes, empathy and delight and other things moved in. So maybe something should be delightful and it should be fun to use. I'm not entirely sure that's the case. I think there are lots of tools and lots of things we develop that shouldn't be delightful because they shouldn't be fun. They are sometimes serious tasks and topics that don't deserve a hint of whimsy, or they are tasks that are complex and that making them fun might pull a little bit of focus away. So you wind up saying, hey, we're gonna reevaluate your 401k. Let's have fun doing it. We go, put the brakes on, pump your brakes. This is my money. I need to be very, very serious about this. So I have this idea of question the goals, question if we want to make usability a key aspect of it, and how we then want to weight it. Because as we're working on the project, that idea of how much effort do we want to put to something, how do we make sure that this is something carried through to the end. Identifying the constraints, asking a lot of questions about constraints in a project. And I find this to be actually the most fun over the last couple of years, because the more you talk about the constraints for a design or for a project, this is where I feel like I personally uncover more and more from my partners and my clients. And I'm pretty sure most of us are used to the constraints of budget, effort, and time, but spending a little more time talking about the constraints of bandwidth, talking about the constraints of how much we think how much attention people are going to give us, talking about constraints of the amount of content we have available and the types of content. Simply by identifying and talking about the constraints early, it makes for fewer questions at the back end when you go, oh, we designed this to have 500 pieces of content, but it turns out we only have the budget for 100 pieces of content, and we just are going to have to fill in everything with Drek, or we're going to have to cut down the design. And as a personal example, something designed for 500 items looks really empty when there's only 100. One last thing in questioning was the more projects I've been doing the last few years, it's working with data. Data has become one of the primary sources of, it's the primary driver for a lot of my projects. And I used to do a lot of projects where it was essentially content which was large slabs of words, big Word documents, lots of editorial content, video content. But as time has passed, it's more and more data, right? And not just dashboards, which I think almost everyone, I kind of wish I could see the room here because I want to go raise your hand if someone's come to you and said, we need to build a dashboard, because I feel like that's been every other conversation for the last year. And that sense of when you're working with data, you can't just take it for what it is. And you have to ask better questions about the data, because if you haven't taken the time to sift through the data, understand what it is, you can't hope to make a design that does the data justice. Whether it should be done justice or not is another question. So I came up with a who, what, when, where, why, how that I always use when I'm looking at data that's going to go into a project. I ask, who measured it? You know, is there a bias that comes from who measured the data and how they chose to measure it? You know, the person who cuts the data often has the ability to give it great shape just by what tables they pull from the database or how they present it to the team. What are the sources? Data is not neutral. Data has biases built into it that are really funky. And this is especially comes from where was it sourced, right? If you find out you've got a batch of data that comes from a bad source, or you don't believe or trust the source, then there's no point, right? The Trump campaign does not want a set of reports that are built on data from Hillary's campaign and vice versa, right? You have to be able to have data that you can trust. You have to know, you want to know where it came from and that it can be useful, which is one of the amazing parts of what folks like 18F and the USD government, the digital government groups are doing. They're putting data out there for citizens to use, and you know it came from the government. You have a pretty good idea of where it came from. You can judge it, but it's better than getting something from maybe a think tank or maybe something that's been passed through by a couple of companies or a brand and that you really don't know where it came from. The when was it generated? I've worked on a project where the data was 2 years old, and that was monumental. The idea that the data could be 2 years old and still be relevant is challenging in almost any industry, right? It's very hard. I'm sure there are two types of people in this world. Those who will make a vague generalization for the purposes of a talk, those who won't. I like to make vague generalizations in a talk. So I can't think of a lot of data sets where 2 years is inconsequential. 2 years means, wait, do we really want to use this data? Let's get something up to date. Why this particular data? Why this data set? And it sort of matches up with the who measured it. Why this particular data? Is it a subset? Is it part of something that we would want to see? I'm always interested in when people generate the pivot tables for a project. You know, is there other stuff we should do to generate the information that goes into it? Where did it come from? It's sort of like what are the sources? Where did it come from? I think not just the sources, but where did it come from geographically? Where did it come from industry-wise makes a big difference. Lastly, how is it packaged? I've done a number of projects lately, and I've been working with data so much, it seems, that I'm often asking, how is this data packaged? When you get data and it's already been put into form, already visualized, right? There's so many amazing things you can do when you visualize data and ship it out that you immediately impress upon people what it can or should be. You know, you take a set of data, you ship it out, and you automatically put it into a bunch of bar charts, and people are already reading it and interpreting it one way. You ship out data, and you put it in a bunch of pie charts, and you cross-reference stuff. People are already making inferences, and they're already judging the data, as opposed to sending out maybe just a straight spreadsheet, and then you get to build your own pivot tables and start to play with it and discover what's there to design for it. So as designers, I think working with data, you have to ask a lot of questions. The next one, clarifying. Clarifying what the project is, clarifying the business goals, the user goals, and the project goals, and reframing and shifting perspective when needed. And so this is somewhat in that idea of opening when you question the goals of the project. I think that as you get deeper into a project, you clarify. You know, as a project goes on, how do you figure out when do you need clarification? When do you want to hone in on this is what we've learned, and maybe we need to rethink it based on some of the goals, you know, that sort of feedback loop. Synthesizing information, and this is probably one of the core parts of it, is that sense of how do I synthesize information? And I broke it down for me into acquiring, prioritizing, identifying, qualifying, and then finally organizing. You know, it's really intense when you think about all the things you do to synthesize information and how do you turn it into insights, right? That sense of, we've talked to a lot of people, so is that enough? Acquiring information. It's not just research, it's different types of research. Depending on the project, do you want to do qualitative or quantitative? And do you need to talk to 50 people or 500? Having that discussion early makes or breaks a project, especially in the research phase, as most folks I'm sure know. But even when you're the designer, having a little bit more of a discussion about how are we going to go get how are we going to go get the information, and prioritizing it. You know, that sense of, we've done 50 interviews. How do we know which ones are worth a little bit more, or how should we value them? How do we weight them? Identifying the information within. One of the hardest things to do is to look at a bunch of information and pluck out the stuff that's important, right? I think this is why so many designers tend to use walls, and why I personally love the sticky note method, where you get all this stuff up on the wall, because when it's all on your screen in front of you, it's one thing, but when you're putting it out onto a wall and you've made your canvas larger, you can identify the smaller pieces within, and you can see something within the whole. I know I struggle when I'm looking at the whole of the information for a project, findings, design inputs, what have you. When it's all on my screen and in a small space, I can churn on it. But the more space I can spread it out over, the more people I can get to look at it, right? That design's almost always better with another person in the room, giving you another set of eyes and saying, hey, maybe that's there, or maybe that's there. It's kind of fun doing this at home when there's really nothing. I'm just pointing at someone and feel like I should be doing a Macarena or something. But that sense of identifying the right information, and that's key. And there's a lot of ways you can think about it. But I feel like that was something where I had to spend more time personally. It was like, I know I have all this information. I know I have all the stuff I need to create, to do my project, but how do I find the right little bits and pieces within? Qualifying the information. And I think qualifying sort of fits up there with prioritization, but it's that sense of what do you keep and what do you throw away? I worked with a research designer years ago who was fantastic, who was semi-famous for doing all of the research and then almost always cutting at least 10% of it right off the bat. Because the idea was we generate so much information. There's some stuff that, it's that idea of cutting the top and the bottom sometimes. You take out the outliers. And when I was starting out as a designer, I was scared witless. It's like, you can't get rid of stuff. It's like, no, there are outliers here. And if we want the outliers to drive the project, that's great. But the way this project is set up, outliers will drive us to edge cases, and edge cases will drive us to insanity, and insanity will mean not a good project. So it's not just that idea of cutting the outliers, the top and the bottom, but learning and practicing over time how to qualify what you have and say, yeah, this is the sweet spot. Anything outside of these parameters we can get rid of. Not that we don't think it's useful, but it's not going to help us make a great design. And lastly, with synthesis, organizing. You have all this information. You have gathered up all the stuff that's going to help you make an amazing design, but how do you organize it in some way that makes sense? And not just for you, but to your partners. And this is I think a big part of being a great designer is not just doing the work, but it's communicating to your partners and your clients along the way and how you did your work, right? The terrible, the stories of all your terrible math teachers from grade school where you had to show your work. I like to think of design as very similar. It's great to come up with one amazing design and have your client go, bravo, bravo, but it doesn't always help them. Sometimes it's better to be able to show, here's how I got to it. So it's reproducible, right? You don't want to, it's great to have a success. It's better to have repeated success that you can easily repeat. Lastly is this idea of interpreting information. And interpreting information is that synthesizing and interpreting are very different, and they seem really the same. And I definitely recommend you go take a look at that article by John Coco, because that's what kind of blew my mind. Is synthesis and interpretation are so different, and they do have very different meanings. And it's that idea of emerging insights from a large data set, emerging insights from the work and the research that you're doing. And on top of that, it's the implications, understanding implications. And I feel like understanding implications connects to that idea of the types of questions you need to ask, because it's easier to see insights. I've found it was easier for me to see insights emerge, but I wasn't as good at understanding the implications. And I realized some of the projects I've done over the years that could have been better came from not identifying the implications early enough, and maybe waiting until the research phase was over and we were halfway down by saying, well, if a whole bunch of people in the research said this, maybe we should have acted on it sooner. Maybe we should have identified those implications. And this sort of last idea of interpreting information is that common sense of, these three questions that get strung together a lot. And this is, what we saw, what it means, and why it matters. I think I've seen this group together in a number of different books talking about research. That idea of coming up with that report at the end that said, this is what we saw or heard, this is what we think it means, and this is why it matters. They're three simple questions, but they're so vital to an a project being successful. And that's interpretation in a nutshell, right? You can't just say what you saw. You have to go a little bit deeper and figure out what insights came from it, what the implications are, and so here's what we think it means. And even more importantly, you have to understand how to put it together and say, this is why this matters, right? I talk about a lot of the work I've done over the years because I have the privilege of having made a lot of mistakes. And I've done research and presented a report that I thought was fantastic, but we didn't really nail why it mattered and why it mattered to this project. And I'm thinking one specifically where the client was incredibly gracious and said, I love everything you've done here. I think it opens up a new set of insights into our customers. I just don't see why it matters for this project. And then the sound you heard in the background was my jaw hitting the floor and the rest of my team going, oh yeah, we were so in love with what we saw and what it meant. We didn't go the next step and say why it matters. And for most clients, why it matters is almost the most important thing. So that's sort of when I think about complementary design skills and I think about the theory of what I do, this idea of, I've been coming back to this time and again, this idea of questioning, clarifying, synthesizing, and interpreting. And underneath each of those, there's more skills to think about, there's more tasks, and there's more things to hone in on to get better at, and not just necessarily think about, well, I'm going to go practice this task, or I'm going to work with this framework. As a designer and a researcher, I think of them as these are the tasks I want to go get better at. These are the skills I want to enhance. And I think they lead to great conversations, because it's kind of cool when I talk to one of my mentors that I would like to get better at going from all this information to bubbling up insights faster. I think I see everything, and at the time, I think I could get a little bit better at finding the emerging insights. And it led to a great conversation with the person. And I have this hope that these types of conversations are even better with bosses and with teams. Like, what are the things that we want to build? Oh, well, it'd be really cool if we could focus on when we're doing when we're gathering information for a project, we're not as good at identifying the constraints early. We're not as good at clarifying. Maybe mid-project we should have a clarifying step, and maybe we should think about looking at some projects where we could have done this better. At the very least, it's a great way to look at your own body of knowledge and figure out what you know and where you might want to grow, where you think you're already where you're already doing awesome, but where you could stand to be a little bit better. So you're only like just half a pinky, just it's like that much. I will finish up quickly with this idea of the other areas I was thinking about, experience and practice, because this idea of if you don't have, I guess they go in this order for me, because if I don't nail down the theory of what I want to learn, then the experience and practice almost don't matter. That sense of, if I identify these parts of my design process I want to get better at, now how do I go get the experience in doing that? How do I find areas, or how do I find projects and people to help me develop it? How do I go from practicing it to refining it, and through repetition, gaining mastery, cross fingers, gaining mastery, and how to seek out people who can teach me those skills, how to seek people who I believe know this, do it well, and can teach me and help bring up my level of skill. And then going through that search for people who do it well leads to looking for inspiration, right? I struggle with a lot of the sort of UX dribble boards where people are doing amazing looking interfaces, but you don't get to see what went on behind it. You don't get a sense of what the process and what the constraints were, right? It's amazing what you can design when you have no constraints. So when you see a design, sometimes it's even better if you could figure out why you could only do this, why this wasn't an option, why this wasn't an option. It's not always available. It's no one's fault, because that's not what Dribble was invented for. and it's not what portfolios in a lot of ways were invented for. You know, they're designed to spark a conversation, and you can't always put that just out on a web page. But then also to take stock of your own body of work and build an inspiration repository. You know, who's doing this well? Where could you find that? Especially for me, identifying practitioners, presenters, writers, folks on Twitter who seem to be doing this well and who I want to follow and learn from. And then lastly, guidance. And I do this, I draw a big line between inspiration and guidance, and that is the idea that there are people that inspire me, but they are not always the people to guide me or mentor me, right? I love Matt Johnson of that's the album you see in the back there. But I wouldn't go to him to learn to play guitar because he plays guitar in a very specific way. He's also not necessarily interested in a 45-year-old guy knocking on his door and saying, hey, are you giving guitar lessons this week? I can only just imagine the door just like, you know, like a cartoon when the door slams and the nose is still stuck between. So for me, it's the idea of thinking about guidance, the idea of identifying peers and mentors, right? Folks who are doing your work, folks who are doing the stuff that matches up with what you have in your day-to-day challenges, folks who are going through those same experiences, you know, maybe the same level, maybe not. Level's a weird thing to sort of identify here. I don't think it's as much level as, you know, the right circumstances. If you're banging your head on a really challenging problem and you're in the financial industry, are you going to get a peer from another industry will be helpful, but it might not be as helpful as if you can actually swap notes with someone who's also doing something in finance, right? Going from finance to film, you know, to someone who's building sites for movies or working in another industry, you know, sometimes the balance is off, is a little bit off. So finding that group of peers, and from within it, finding some mentors, and not just rushing to, not just identifying someone, but knowing what you want to talk about. I'll be very specific. I've had some great mentoring sessions, and the best ones are when someone came to me, and I hope the best ones for me, when I went to someone with some really strong, specific questions. Open-ended, not, you know, is it this or this, but coming up with, this is what I need help with. Is this something you can help me with? Or can you point me to someone else if you're not the right person, right? Making it easier for the person that you want help from to meet you right away and give you that help. Lastly, I think there's that idea of the more you understand, again, I did the you, so I'm going to say the me. The more I understood my inspiration and my goals for guidance, it made it a lot easier for me to identify when and where I could give back, right? You really shouldn't put yourself out there as a guide and a mentor for a skill set you're not completely comfortable with. You should be comfortable with what you do. You should have a great set of knowledge, a solid set of knowledge that you can talk about and leverage when you decide to go out and help other people. So it was important for me to decide, hey, I would like to give back to my industry. I want to nail down a few things in my own, I want to fix my own house up first, and I want to nail down what I think I know before I go to people and say, hey, I'm here to help, because I want to help. I don't just want to add to the noise, and I don't just want to confuse other people. Confused enough on my own, I really don't want to make it worse for anybody else. So that goes through what I was, so that is the theory, experience, inspiration, guidance. And I think that's about everything I was hoping to talk about. I hope it made sense. I hope you laughed once or twice. And I am really thankful to Dave for having me out here. And I think we might try to do a Q&A. I don't know, but I'm going to pass it to Dave, and let's see what we can come up with.
Thanks a lot, Boon. That's really great. I got a lot. We have, I don't see the YouTube live. We have a couple of questions, or at least one question. I have a question as well. Bill Bernstein says, throwing out, setting aside outliers. When presenting work to developers or to technical-minded clients, I've had all the first questions and worries be completely about those edge cases, almost to the point where they barely focus on the primary happy path. What's the best way to deal with that?
That is an awesome question, especially when you talk about technically minded, right? Some of my favorite designers are the folks that seek out edge cases, right? And there's something about problem solving that loves the edge case. Trying to think of the best ways I've done it. The best ways I've done it in a presentation, or ways I've been happy with it in a presentation, is to almost put the outliers in an addendum or an appendix. So I'm thinking specifically of a project where we gathered a lot of information. We did a large number of interviews, and there were folks really out of the mean. There were folks just way off the edge, and their challenges, how do I put this? Their challenges could not be solved by the team. So I had an internal discussion with not the manager, not the engineering manager, but the product manager, and we went through those a little bit, and we made them an appendix. So we focused on the happy path, which is still a phrase I love. We focused on the common scenarios, and we went through those. Another way to do it, and this might work with very technically minded. I know it worked at least with one hardcore numbers guy. When we had the outliers, we made some attempt to quantify the value of the outliers. So in this case, we're talking about customer acquisition. So customer acquisition had some numbers. We went and tracked the value of acquiring a customer versus losing one, and we put values to the outliers. And so I can't remember exactly how we put this together, but the way to get everyone to calm down about the outliers was to say they were less than 10% of the value of everybody else. And so there was no money to be made spending time fixing the edge cases. Hope that makes sense.
Very cool. The question I had was, you mentioned about showing your work, which I love that idea. I've only kind of done that in the past on, use the term, waterfall projects, where we have an end and then you can have the big reveal, or we have the documentation handover at the end, But how do you see that working I know a lot of people work in a more agile or, less waterfall rather than stricter agile environments where they're now looking at products rather than projects. How can we kind of keep that showing your work ethos going?
Sure, it's an excellent question, because there's the variations of agile and waterfall, right? There's wagile, that sort of, we're not agile, but we're not waterfall. I have tried to track design work to development sprints and done design check-ins. So when I'm working as a designer, independent of a design team, I've tried to match up with their schedule so that as they're wrapping up a sprint and they're doing a retrospective, I'm bringing in design materials to show them what's happening as we go. And it's tougher. But sometimes it's as simple as spending a little bit of time mid-sprint or at the end of a sprint, sort of having a semi-regular design check-in where you're showing what's up to date, you're showing what's going on. It's a challenge because I had a project where I diligently created updates every sprint and put together a great set of a report. Here's what we're doing. Here's how the interviews are going. Here are the highlights. And no one ever read them. And it was heartbreaking, but I wanted to keep doing it because in case someone ever wanted the data or wanted the information, they'd get it. But it made more sense to physically get in the space and talk a little bit. And my experience with dev teams has been getting a half hour to an hour to talk about design isn't that hard. But getting in their space was the true changer. Had to be there to talk to them.
Oh, great! That's a really interesting way to do it. Because I think I'm going to come up against that fairly soon myself. So that was a bit of a selfish question.
No, I totally dig, and it happens all the time, right? How do you integrate, dev and design, and how do you find a way to have that conversation, a running conversation? And so on some level, it's about, and I'm trying to do this not with a dev team, but a team I'm working with, and they're going to be implementing designs that I'm coming up with, is just about maybe every 2 weeks, here's what's happened. And even just 5 bullets of here's, you know, especially when we're in the middle of research and we're not really at a big ta-da, as you know, saying, but just, hey, here's what's happening this week. Here's what we've learned. Here's what we've done. And even just an email, an informal email with 5 bullet points. You know, people usually have enough time to read 5 bullet points and then they're on to something else. So I might try that.
Great. The other thing that I'd got written down was the idea of, you know, now we've moved from ease of use, as you said, being table stakes. You know, we're all now, the web and the industry has now got to that point where, yeah, we all kind of realize that. But now we're starting to realize that some things maybe shouldn't have an element of delight or should have an element of seriousness or urgency about it. I wonder if you can just sort of elaborate on that. I know Eric and Sarah have just published just a part book about that kind of stuff, and we see that online a lot as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's vital to pay attention to the emotional impact of whatever's happening. So I will speak specifically to a scenario, and I have to think about how to do it to make sure it all works. But a company I was doing some work for had a challenge with too many people going to the call center and not doing something online that they thought was easy to do. And they were struggling with why so many people were heading to the website and, they were heading to the phone lines instead of doing it online. And it turns out the thing they were trying to do online often involved the loss of a spouse or a child. It was an incredibly emotionally wrought transaction, and that at the first sign of trouble, people wanted to pick up the phone and call. And it was way, way too heavy emotionally to try to complete it online. And it was fascinating because it seemed to be a very consistent behavior. People said, I'm not doing this now. I'm not doing this online. And they would cancel out, and then they would find out days later they would call. And they'd be frustrated because it was so emotionally fraught. And that was my first exposure to this idea a couple of years ago, with that idea of the web. When I started working in sort of the web and the startup environment and the go-go days of the late 90s, everything about the web was fun. Everything was, dude, we're going to save you money. This is going to be fast. This is going to be easy. The web wasn't really even seen as serious. I mean, I think of the days of, I did a lot of work for eHealth, drcoop.com and mothernature.com, Health Answers, where we always had PharmDs in the building going, guys, this is serious stuff. You got to take out all the fun little bits, take out all the cartoon characters. And I think WebMD is an interesting example now of, it's full of information, but it's also, I don't know if you've noticed, their tone is it feels like everything you go to WebMD is like, congratulations, you have cancer. It's super intense. So as we're doing more and more in our daily life on the web, it shouldn't all be hilarious, right? I think Eric and Sarah have identified some amazing situations that were incredibly painful and hurtful to the people who had to go through them, Eric in particular. Personally, I know I've had Facebook memories show up of the day my cat died, because there were it had 500 comments on it, and it was something very important. And at the time, Facebook said, hey, this is your major memory from last year. And I went, great. It just reminded me that my cat's dead. Thanks for that. So there's always room to make something fun. There's always room to make it not just easy to use, but brings people back. There's all the different stuff like you see in Dan Saffer's book, and talk about micro interactions, the little things that help get rid of friction. But there are lots of times where I think specifically health, finance, insurance, things that, they deserve a little bit of gravity and they deserve a little bit of attention, and levity is okay. But when are you really trying to make this fun, or are you trying to make sure that people are healthy, happy, and they're financially set for life. I would want the person on the other side of the desk to be serious, so I would like the website I'm interacting with to be serious.
That's a great point, putting it into the more human connection of, like, if I went into somewhere, if I went in to see the doctor, I don't expect the doctor to be kind of like, hey, guy, you know, I mean, or the financial guy. So maybe you have that tone, you know, you can be a little bit light in maybe in the advertising part of the things, but once you get into the actual transaction, the interaction, that's when you kind of tone that down.
Mint did such a great job of making finances not necessarily, I don't know if they made it seem fun, but they took the edge off it. They made it, Mint was clearly successful making finance seem not so stuffy. And that's great. And that's worked incredibly well for them. I think, I'm thinking specifically of scenarios around financial planning that I've been involved with, where it was strip away everything and strip away, because we're now about to make, it's that idea of, scenario that was presented to me was they were trying to come up with better design for 401k loans. And if you take a loan out of your 401k, you pay really heavy penalties. And it's not that you can't, it's just that you really shouldn't unless you absolutely have to. So my discussion at the time was we should have a little bit of friction. So it shouldn't be easy to pull 50,000K out of your 401k retirement fund. You should be allowed to do it for sure. You shouldn't make it hard, but we shouldn't make it frictionless and fun, because the financial ramifications of that are really, really bad. And you don't want someone to do it by mistake and go, oh, well, crap, what have I just done?
That's a great point. Well, I don't think we have any other questions. I don't see anything on Twitter or on here, but it's been great. Thank you very, very much, Boon, for doing this for us. And agreeing to be our first YouTube Live.
Happy to be a guinea pig.
So let me just make myself presenter. And say, I wanted to thank Boon very much for doing this. If you're watching this after this, not on the live thing, you can find out more details of this and other presentations we're having by going to IxDACleveland.org or following us on Twitter at IxDA Cleveland. And we should be having one a month, hopefully throughout 2016, and then we'll see where we go from there. And there'll be a mixture of actually in Cleveland in different places, and again, I'm hoping on YouTube Live. So thank you very much to everyone who tuned in. Thanks for the questions, and thanks again, Boon. I'll be seeing everyone very soon. Bye-bye.